All right. Good morning, everybody. Good evening or good afternoon, depending for where are you located. We are here at the headquarters of CGIAR in Cali. Welcome to this webinar. I will quickly present the core team of the COP. And they are here with me. So here's Danielle, here's Maya Camila, here's Vitske, and myself, I'm Sylvain. We are very glad to host this webinar today. Thank you for joining. I will introduce also our presenters. So online we have Mariette Campbell. She will be the first presenting. We have Michael Carter from UC Davis, and as you saw on the program, Caroline Flore from Erie. She couldn't join us, but we have her presentation recorded, so we will be able to see her presentation. So the schedule is like this. We will now have a quick introduction to this webinar by Danielle, and then we will move on with Mariette's presentation. Then we'll have the presentation from Caroline, and then we have Michael Carter. And at the end, we have a 20-minute Q&A session where you can ask everything you want to the panel and to us also. So I pass the floor over to Daniel for an introduction.
Okay, hello guys, and thanks for attending to this webinar. Actually, I would like just briefly to provide you with some context on when this idea is coming from. So it started 2 years ago as part of this big data platform initiative, the CGIAR. We had usually conventions. The first one took place here in Cali, and in that event, in that convention, we saw some scientists and high-tech people presenting a wide range of approaches tackling or addressing agronomic problems like pests and diseases, the most profitable crop, weather forecast. But unfortunately, what we didn't see, what they didn't explain was like the methods that they were using. Like most of them use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all those methods, satellite imagery, but they didn't explain quite well why they were doing this. We started to wonder, like, at some point, you know, someone needs to dig in a little bit more and see a little bit deeper, see, you know, what's real there. So I remember back in those days in the late 90s or in the 90s when there were no standards for the way how growers were implementing crop management. So agribusiness companies took advantage of that situation, and the market was overwhelmed by a lot of chemical products. So in the late 90s, there was one initiative called Global GAP, like global agricultural practices. And they kind of set up a standard that now is using even for making business. So we're not trying to say that we should do the same thing, right? But that at least we are absolutely sure that we need standards for data-driven agronomic services and data-driven decision support systems. So the idea as community with this webinar is a start. It would be like a kickoff of we as a community, how can we work together as a collective in probably 2 years from now, to see what we can propose as a community in order to standardize more and be more responsible with small-scale growers in the developing world. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Daniel. So we will rapidly move on, and I pass the floor over to Mariette, if you're ready for the presentation. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, let me get. Oh, I'm trying to.
Mariette? So it seems we're having an issue with Mariette's connection. Let's give her some minutes to connect back. All right. This is the kind of issues you have when you're live. Michael, would you be ready to shift with Mariette and start presenting, maybe?
Research is on a project that's called ICT for
We have Mariette back. Mariette, we lost you for some reason. It seems you're back. So, all right.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sylvain, for that feedback. So, as I said, I'm based with IATA in Rwanda, and I work on a project called ICT for BXW. It's a project that basically tries to see how we can leverage ICT technologies and citizen science to improve the situation around control and prevention of Xanthomonias gull disease in banana, which is a widely problematic issue in East and Central Africa and hugely affecting banana farmers. Besides that, I'm linked to a project called EVOCA, which is a project that again looks into digital technologies within the African continent, and those are all kinds of technologies related to water and agronomic practices as well as human diseases. And so the idea is, again, to look into what can ICT actually mean for people and in terms of solving complex problems. One of my research interests is very much related to what do people and technology do to one another, basically. So how are they affecting each other? And this is why I became very interested in ICT for ag, because it's seen as a growing field and it's getting a lot of attraction. And based on that, I reviewed lots of the literature, and I came to the understanding that there is many tools around there, and yet we know very little about them. So together with a scientist, Peter Thomas from Biometries in Wageningen University, I'm currently setting up a literature review, a systematic review into all these different ICT for ag technologies that are out there. And our goal is to find out about what is the available evidence that these kinds of tools and technologies actually have a use and what they are contributing, and also looking at what kinds of tools are out there and what are their different objectives. So based on that, we hope to really collect some data and that is shareable and that shows us a lot more and gives us more knowledge about this relatively new phenomenon that is ICT for agriculture, and especially for developing countries. So that is particularly our focus. And the reason why is because we see that ICT for ag is receiving so much attention, and we see a huge number of different initiatives. But as I said, what do we actually know about if they work and how they work? So our aim is really to gather the kinds of evidence that would be required to say what works, what doesn't work, and who is really affected by that. So in brief, what kinds of tools and platforms are we looking at? Well, our aim is to largely look from a client perspective. And talking about clients, we're mostly talking about farmers and local level actors such as agronomists or buyers, which is usually the target group of most of these platforms, because we want to make a contribution to people's livelihoods. And based on that, looking into that, I made a simple breakup of the different typologies of these data-driven tools that are out there today. I deliberately only limited myself to those that are somehow related to agronomic practices, basically. So of course you could add categories like finance, but even though they have a relationship to agriculture and to people's ability to invest, for example, in agriculture, but they're not directly related to the data-driven agronomy, the way I see it.
Mariette,
Yes.
sorry, I'm not seeing your screen. Can you share it, please?
The way Okay, let me try again. It says it's sharing it now, Sylvain. Can you see it?
Yes, this is better.
Okay, let me make it full screen again. Is it visible?
Yeah, this is good.
Okay, good, great. So yeah, back to that. So basically 5 different categories. The extension category, which is largely about providing people with information and decision support, and diagnostics, all the different technologies out there for diagnostics of pests, diseases, all kinds of soil conditions, very much driven by NGOs and research still, which are integrating it with some of the more high-tech technologies, drones, machine learning, etc. Then I see that there is a growing group of applications that are actually trying to register farmers. So, for example, here in Rwanda, there is a huge initiative right now that is even driven by one of the bigger banks, and that has the objective to register millions of farmers in Rwanda such that they can continue accessing subsidized fertilizers, but also to allow the opportunity to actually have more insight into farmers' practices. Then there's the category which is around weather, and I think that's also a growing group of applications that is really looking into weather forecasts and providing decision support, sometimes linking it with insurance packages, as well as linking it to high-tech sensory data, imagery, etc. And finally, there's a group that is directly related to linking farmers to markets, and that is very much in terms of making the value chain more visible and more transparent to all those actors that are actually somehow relying on that value chain. So I tried to just give a few examples of the more well-known applications out there. Most of them are somehow also related to the work that the CGIAR is doing. For example, the Nuru application, which I think is very well known within the big data community, but also Isoko, which has been around for a very long time, started off looking mostly at markets, but today they actually have broadened their range of services that they're offering. I think that is another thing that we're seeing. Most of these applications start out very much operating in a silo and then start to broaden their scope and add more functionality over time. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot of ambitious, motivated initiatives out there. And there's a lot of vision and mission, I think, for most of these initiatives to really try and make a change to farmers' lives. So, and when we look at that, they still have a lot in common. They have the kinds of traits that basically come down to the objective to bring people and services together, and also to gain more insights, rather around what kind of information is available today, but also to add more information in terms of filling the gaps. And the idea is, of course, that with this technology, you can reduce the cost and improve the speed and the accuracy of information collection and sharing of information. But I think there's still a lot we can learn, and there's many challenges, and sometimes they're overlooked, or they're maybe seen as something that would be easy to improve or easy to overcome. So, for example, I think the idea is that nowadays almost everybody has access to mobile phone technology, and that I think is the key technology that provides people access to all these data-driven agronomy tools. And yes, at the global scale, this is definitely true. And then when we're looking at, for example, in the country where I'm working, Rwanda, today about 80% of the population has access to mobile phone technology, looking at the number of registered SIM cards. Yet the project that I'm working on conducted a baseline a bit earlier this year, and I basically just got access to that data, to that information. And looking at that, we see that there's still a group of 27% of the farmers that we interviewed, which was about 700 in our sample, that don't access mobile phone technology. So they just are basically inaccessible to us. And looking at what kind of ICT technologies they basically access is that most of them purely rely on basic phones. And that is 70%. And there's only a handful of those farmers that can access the smartphone technologies, and so also the kind of app technologies that would be required to use data-driven agronomy. And at the same time, we see, and I think that's also important to notice, that some of these sort of conventional technologies like radio are still crucial to most of the farmers to access information. And then at the same time, another challenge is that the expectation is that access to smartphone devices and internet is very rapidly growing, and that this is becoming something that will soon be a universal technology that's accessible. Yet again, the data from our survey among village-level extensionists, which are the most important extension providers to the majority of farmers in Rwanda, shows that hardly any of them actually accesses smartphone technology or internet. The reality is that most of them purely rely on calls and SMS, and many of them have huge issues by, for example, affording themselves to make those calls. And if they can't, they still have to move around by foot. So lots of it is much more traditional than maybe we're hoping for. Thirdly, another challenge that I would like to touch upon is the sustainability and the profitability of the tools and platforms. And I think this is, again, a very important factor to notice, because many of the applications that exist today might not be around 5 years from now. For example, to quote some of the work that has been done by Jenny Aker, where she looked at in 2011 at different platforms that are out there and sort of reviewed all of them. If you look at those today, by far the majority is no longer accessible, or they're not being maintained anymore. So it says a lot about the talent sustainability. And then some others that we basically know very little about yet. So this is one of our other review objectives. We have very little know-how about how data-driven agronomy might be affecting the indigenous ways of communicating and knowledge exchange, as well as what is happening to gender roles when women are starting to access technologies more. Is that affecting the way agriculture is taking place? At the same time, the expectation is that there's a good cost benefit for these kinds of technologies, but what do we really know about it? And lastly, I think the issue of scale. And when you look at it today, the scalability of many of the platforms are also questionable, and yet we have very little insight. And lastly, I think this is one of the key points that definitely for our review as well, is that we don't really know anything about the short and long-term impact. And I think the limitation there is that in most cases we look into the short-term impact, or maybe not even impact, but just this output of the number of people that have registered. For example, just a few days ago, there was this publication by the Big Data platform about the partnership with Viamo, where they're working in Malawi and they have about 700,000 farmers registered. And this is, of course, great, and this is definitely an achievement. Yet what is happening beyond that registration? What is happening once someone has registered? Are they actually actively using the platform? And if so, what is being done with that information that they gather? Is it passed on to others? Does it actually turn into knowledge and know-how and changing practices? We know very little about that. So just to come to my conclusions, firstly, I think there's a huge momentum for data-driven agronomy and ICT for agriculture, and we see that in the investments of donors and the kind of enthusiasm that this topic is gaining. Yet we need to work on the science of it. We need to get the evidence right. And then related to that, I think there's a huge task for the different CGIAR centers and other knowledge institutes to work on gathering that evidence. It might not be the role of all the different NGOs or governments who are working in it. It might be a pure task where research centers could be hugely beneficial. And this should happen to show that all the investments that are happening today are worth their money, and that in the end, we are benefiting farmers and other actors at the local level rather than over time discouraging them to further invest in technology. I hope that this was an interesting sort of teaser. I'm very interested also to hear from the other speakers about their kind of practical experience. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A after this and do a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Mariette. Right on time. To participants, please remember that you are able to engage with us through the chat. I think it's on the right hand of your screen. So do not hesitate to post questions anytime. After any presentation, we have a very short 4 to 5 minute slot for very specific question on the presentation. So if you want to ask the presenter something very specific on the presentation, you can do that, and we'll take the question from the chat. So okay, actually we have one. So Evaristo is asking about the gender roles. A very good point. Do you have gender disaggregated phone ownership data? Question to Mariette.
Yeah, actually we do. I didn't put it in, as I said, this data is just been coming into our office, and this is like, I took this from the draft report that we have on our data, but definitely there's gender aggregation, and there's also aggregation in terms of age. And we could further aggregate based on education level. So yes, that information is out there, but I don't have it on hand right now that I could rapidly share it with you, unfortunately. But I'd be happy to share a bit more detail if people are very interested later.
Okay, awesome. Now I'm hearing equal. Okay. We will move on to the following presentation. The presenter is Caroline Fleuret from Erie. So as I said, she was not able to join live, but we have the presentation ready. So I will try to do the trick here. Let me see. I will share my screen now. This one. Okay. All right, let's see if it works.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Fleuret, and I'm the Technology for Development Lead at the International Rice Research Institute. And apologies for not being able to join you live for this webinar. Unfortunately, I'm on a plane currently from Cape Town to Manila. But I wanted to share some lessons in technology for development standards, taking lessons from the digital health sector and thinking about their eventual or their potential, application to digital agriculture. So just to jump right in, over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll start with a brief introduction to myself, talk about the problem statement that myself and my colleagues on this webinar will be discussing, a brief introduction or hopefully a refresher to the principles for digital development, and then introducing a few reference frameworks and tools that have been launched in the digital health sector that could be interesting or have potential applications for digital agriculture as well. And so to introduce myself, just so you know why I'm talking about digital health specifically as someone who works at Erie. Previously, I was at USAID as a private sector partnership specialist working on public-private partnerships that dealt with digital health, specifically working with private sector companies. And I was then at United Nations Foundation as the mHealth Senior Manager, working on a catalytic grants program for mHealth, as well as the Saving 1 Million Lives program in Nigeria. And after that, I was the Director for Collective Impact at the Digital Impact Alliance, or DIA, which is also housed at United Nations Foundation. And I've been with Erie since about January of this year, thinking about the use of digital tools for an organization that focuses on race research. And so just to launch right in, and I think my other colleagues have addressed this as well in terms of thinking about our core problem statement, that in the digital agriculture sector, we're seeing a lot of different applications of technologies. But the issue is we don't have a systematic way to evaluate and compare each of these different tools. And so how can we help various audiences, from farmers to agricultural extension workers to governments, really make informed decisions and compare apples to apples, and think about how can we use standards to actually do that. And so before we launch or sort of go into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to do a quick refresher on the principles for digital development, which are stewarded by the Digital Impact Alliance, but were founded and identified and written by the digital community, the digital development community as a whole, and thinking about how do we integrate these different principles into various stages of project implementation from the very beginning to make sure that as digital development professionals, we're thinking about designing with the user, understanding this larger ecosystem that we work in, as well as the other ones that you see here. And hopefully this is a refresher and not new information, but I would encourage all of you to dig into the digital principles if you're not familiar with them at digitalprinciples.org. And one of the reasons the digital principles were founded around 2012 was because of what you see here. In Uganda in 2008, those who work in digital health are very familiar with this map, as it's the first time there was an assessment of all of the digital health interventions in Uganda around that time. And so as you can see on this map, there were a number of digital health interventions, I think over 60 different ones. And the government realized, the Ministry of Health realized that they didn't have a hold on and they didn't know what was happening in the country. And so there was an effort, there was actually a moratorium that the Ministry of Health put on the implementation of digital health programs to say, let's understand what's happening in the country. Let's put all of these, put all of these together, understand what the interoperability potential is of these, who's doing what, where is there duplication of efforts. And so it was the first time that the Ministry of Health really took control and took charge and said, we need to understand what these different interventions are. And so that's just sort of a basis to say, for the digital health sector, there has been this period of 1,000 flowers blooming that we're kind of seeing in digital agriculture right now. And so since then, there's really been a focus, or since digital health has sort of started, there's really been a focus on building out the evidence base to make sure, it is the health sector and there's a do no harm focus to make sure that digital health is making use of the limited resources that are available to make sure that donors have increased transparency into the investments that they're making as well. And so at the beginning, really building that out, because you had a lot of technical specialists, be it from non-communicable diseases to maternal and child health, et cetera, who were very skeptical of the various interventions that were taking place to make sure that they actually were impactful and really making a difference as well. And so what we see is that there was a real focus on this evidence base and building out a shared framework or taxonomy. And in order to do this, as we think about evidence, it's building that out to make sure that we're able to communicate both within the digital health sector as well as outside of the digital health sector, to be able to talk about these interventions in the same way, to identify gaps and opportunities for action, avoid that duplication that we saw on the map of Uganda, and identify the opportunities where we can actually work together and complement the work that each of our organizations are doing. And so what I wanted to really focus on is, after all of this evidence gathering took place, there was really an effort to build out a few core tools that were using the evidence and building upon all of the work that had been done. And so we're going to review a few of those over the next few minutes. And so the goal of these was really to think about digital tools from a health system strengthening point of view to really improve the quality of care and outcomes in the health sector. And so one of the first things that was done in efforts from organizations such as the World Health Organization and Johns Hopkins University, along with UNICEF, was to map out what are the core challenges within the health system. And so you can see the result of that work here across these different pieces. So information, availability, quality, acceptability, utilization, efficiency, cost, and accountability. And so in doing this and understanding what are the core challenges in the health system as a whole, not thinking about digital health, but what are the challenges within the health system, you can really kind of hone in on, okay, what are the specific ways that digital technologies can unlock these challenges? And so, we see this, and this is directly applicable to the digital agriculture sector as well, taking interventions of known efficacy that there are a number of them in the digital, in health, the health sector, right? So take maternal and child health, for example. We know that an increase in the number of institutional deliveries of children is going to decrease maternal mortality, decrease child mortality. And so we know that that happens. And we know that the ultimate outcome of that at the top right is improving the quality and coverage of health intervention and increasing or decreasing mortality. But the issue along the way is that you see these different challenges, such as poor services, failure to follow guidelines, commodity stock out, depending on the various intervention of the sector that we're focused on here within health. And so even though we know what the intervention, the proven intervention is to get to this outcome, we're not able to get there because of these specific challenges. And so what we see for mobile technology, again, similar in agriculture, is the opportunity to use these tools to overcome these specific challenges. And so using these digital strategies to address the constraints or these challenges. And so we see this in the agricultural sector as well, at institutions like the International Rice Research Organization and other CG centers. There have been a number of interventions, science-based interventions for a number of crops that we know work. But there are challenges kind of plague us along the way so we don't get to increasing the yields and incomes that we're trying to get to farmers. And so one of the things that was done in the digital health sector based on those various challenges was to think about, okay, now we know what these challenges are, and we have a catalog of all of the different types of interventions that digital tools could be applied to. And so not thinking about digital health or mHealth as a monolith, but within the sector, there was a very large effort to think about these 12 different categories for digital health. And so you can see in some of these, just to kind of draw some of the parallels, ones like data collection and reporting would be similar. Health records would be, your farmer diaries, for example. Number 9, provider training and education, agricultural extension worker training and education. And so you can really see, okay, these are the various categories where digital health interventions can take place. Going back, you can see at the top the various actors, right? So at the top, on the top left, you see that it's mother and child. And in the agricultural sector, that would be maybe the agricultural extension worker and a farmer, for example. And then you go down and think about, okay, what are the ICT applications for this particular intervention? So for this one, it's only going to map out of those 12 categories, what are the specific ones that you could actually use? At the bottom of this slide, you can see the specific points in time where the interventions are going to take place. And so what this framework really allows you to do is kind of dig into the details of the where, who, what, when, how. And so here, when along the continuum of care are you going to be using a particular digital intervention? What is that intervention that's being enhanced? What are the specific health constraints that are trying to be overcome? How is the digital health tool being applied? And where is the actual implementation going to engage? And so what's interesting here is, and you can see some of the examples here as well and think about the parallels in the digital agriculture sector. But what this allows you to do as an implementer or as an evaluator of a digital health tool is to really think methodically about, okay, how am I going to be using this tool? What is the specific challenge that I'm trying to address, so that you're not just throwing out a digital tool just for the sake of using a digital tool, but you're using it for a specific purpose along the continuum of care that's addressing a very specific problem. And so again, as you see on this slide, it's only selecting a few of those ICT applications that are applicable for your particular intervention. And so this particular framework has been used in a number of other tools that have been developed by the United Nations Foundation, by WHO, by Johns Hopkins University. And one of these is the Digital Health Atlas. And this is a web-based platform or catalog that provides a guide for all of the implementations, provides a platform to allow different agencies, different audiences to access and understand what are the interventions that are currently being used and implemented, where are they, and what stage of growth are they in. And so that's using the framework that we just saw, and this is kind of a screenshot of the Digital Health Atlas. And another tool that's been integrated into the Digital Health Atlas is the mHealth Assessment and Planning for Scale Toolkit, or the MAPS Toolkit. And this is providing actionable information to improve scale for mHealth interventions. And so again, going back to the principles for digital development, thinking about designing for scale from the very beginning, and thinking about using this particular tool to say, okay, these are the different aspects of implementation that I should be thinking about to make sure that I'm implementing a tool that is actionable and effective at the end of the day. Which parts of these, are stronger? Which parts of your intervention might be stronger, and where there might be gaps or opportunities for improvement? And so integrated into the Digital Health Atlas are these different components of the MAPS toolkit. So you can see, for a given intervention, what their progress is in terms of groundwork or financial health, for example. And you can see the progress as those improve too. The next tool that I wanted to introduce just very briefly is thinking about mHealth Evidence Reporting and Assessment Checklist, or mERA. And so the guiding principle behind this particular tool is to think about or understand what is the mHealth intervention, where is it being implemented, and how is it being implemented. And this provides a frame for standardization across the digital health sector. So, there was a real effort to catalog the different evidence that existed. So, going through a complete literature review, understanding what people are writing about and the research they're doing, and the different interventions that are being implemented. But the issue in doing that assessment is there wasn't a standardized way for talking about digital health. And so there wasn't any way for us to build out an evidence base because we were talking about it in completely different languages. And so we weren't even able to compare against each other because there wasn't a way to understand what was actually going on. And so what mERA actually does, and this is a very dense slide, so I would encourage everyone to kind of go through it at a later stage, thinking about these different criteria for mHealth evidence reporting so that as you're putting together your evidence for your particular intervention, you're talking about it in the same way as your intervention in Senegal is talking about your SMS intervention for tobacco cessation in the same way that another intervention in Tanzania is talking about it, for example. And so some of the challenges or some of the lessons from digital health that can be applied to digital agriculture in terms of thinking about, as I mentioned, sort of 1,000 flowers blooming, and what evidence is there for us to understand as a community what is the intervention that works and what doesn't work. How can we guide investments in this sector? How can we break down some of the silos that exist? We're talking about data-driven agronomy, but the breeders are talking about something else, and the soil scientists are talking about other things. So how can we make sure that we're all talking about it in the same way? How can we also make sure, as the technology does change on a very rapid clip, we're talking about the same things, or we're staying ahead of the curve, and we're integrating technology in a really thoughtful way, and taking lessons from other sectors like digital health that might be a bit more mature than digital agriculture. I also wanted to mention, governments as funders, and this is something that we saw a lot in digital health, is governments, national governments, state governments are making more investments in their own, in their sectors, but they're not necessarily technologists. And so you have, people in the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture that might be interested in the use of ICTs, but they're not talking to the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of ICT necessarily. And so how can we make sure that they have a better understanding of the interventions that are taking place? And also thinking about in the various geographies that we work in, regulation and policy is still catching up as well. And so I just wanted to mention across these three different pieces, the application or the lessons for digital agriculture in terms of evidence, catalogs, and frameworks. In terms of evidence, I think that there's a real opportunity in the digital agriculture sector to think about and really dig into what we know works and what does not work. And I would love to see this evidence base built out for digital agriculture in the same way that there was a real focus on it for digital health. And also thinking about various catalogs that we could put together as a community for understanding what are the interventions that are out there, what's being implemented, are they being implemented well, are they being implemented at scale, and what's happening. So we can do our work in a very thoughtful way and thinking about the partners that we want to work with in a very thoughtful way. But also building out some of these frameworks that we similar to the ones that we see in the digital health sector, so that we understand what we're talking about when we talk to each other. And I think this community practice is a really interesting example, right, as well as the platform. So what do we mean when we talk about big data? Are we all on the same page? What do we mean when we talk about data-driven agronomy? What does that mean to everyone? What is the common language that we as a community can have, so that when we talk about something, we know that we're all talking about the same thing. And so, one example is, I'm guessing that everyone is familiar with this agricultural value chain, that this is adapted from Chris Burns' presentation at USAID, in thinking about, okay, maybe this is one way that we could create a framework and thinking about the agricultural value chain, and what are the challenges along each stage in this particular value chain, and what are the digital interventions that could be used to address those specific challenges. And so I'm right at the end of my time and just wanted to provide a bit of a summary in terms of, we're a bit more nascent than digital health in some ways. And we don't have to do everything at once. But I think it is important to always consider the principles for digital development as we do that, and thinking about how can we build up the evidence or catalogs and frameworks to really guide the work that we're doing so that we have the most effective and impactful interventions at the end of the day. So thank you very much. Please feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have. And thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I hope you have a great webinar. Take care.
All right. Stop sharing my screen. Great. So this was Caroline Flores' presentation from MIRI. We thought it was pretty inspiring to invite this kind of contribution from other sectors, because what we've seen is that, as she said in the presentation, other sectors have made a lot of progress on similar issues or problematic that we are pretending to address now with this community. So I think we can hugely benefit from what has been done in different sectors. All right, this is very good. I will now pass the floor over to Michael, if you're ready, for our last presentation.
Yes, can you hear me?
Great, yeah, that's good. Michael, thank you. The floor is over to you.
Okay, and are are you seeing my screen now?
We are seeing the screen. That's great.
Excellent. Okay. So hello, everyone, wherever you might be. So what I thought I would talk about is a set of issues we've been wrestling with around agricultural insurance. So let me jump right in. So first off, let me make sure we have a common understanding of what I'm going to refer to as index insurance. So when we think about conventional insurance, or what I call here on the slide loss adjusted insurance, that's an insurance when the farmer has a loss. He then calls the insurance company and they send someone out to investigate the loss to make sure that it's a true natural disaster and not the farmer not taking care of his or her crops. For small scale farmers, that kind of loss adjustment simply is not cost effective. It costs too much money to send a person out to investigate what's happened to a small scale farmer. We have plenty of evidence that doesn't work. A lot of countries tried that in the 1970s and 1980s and created disasters of their own. The idea of index insurance is to get rid of this loss adjustment phase and to find an insurance index, which is the basis of determining payments. This index is correlated with the losses farmers experiences, but not identical to the losses that the farmer experiences. If the index can be remotely sensed, as an example I'll give in just a minute, then you shortcut all these costs, which traditionally have made it impossible to sustainably offer insurance to the small scale farming sector. So most of current efforts to use index insurance are based on some sort of remote sensing or satellite data. So on the left side of my screen, I'm showing some NDVI maps from an area in northern Kenya where we launched a project a few years ago with the ILRI, International Livestock Research Institute. This is a forage-based contract, NDVI signals, which is what's being shown on those two maps on the left side. We were able to show that there's a strong correlation between farmer losses and the behavior of the NDVI measure. So when the NDVI measure falls below some level, then payments are issued. And the current implementation of this, which is actually now being led by the government of Kenya under a program called CLIP, Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, they are using all sorts of mobile technology, so farmers can actually purchase the insurance using mobile phones. Payments are made through the mobile money system of Kenya. And again, there's no need for the insurance company to show up and investigate losses. Payments are simply issued based on what the satellite shows. So that's the background on index insurance, and it's a very exciting way that big data is being used to try to relax constraints for farmers. So here on this slide, there's 2 points I want to make. First, there's a small but growing impact evaluation literature, which examines the impact of index insurance. And for the most part, the impacts have been found to be quite large and actually be very, very cost effective. So obviously the whole idea here is that if you can insure people after a drought, if they have security that the insurance will protect them and their families or protect their working capital in their farm, then that relaxes a constraint to their before the drought or ex ante behavior. Farmers become more willing to increase their levels of investment in their farm. So, for example, one study we did in Mali, we found that, and this was an experimental trial, we found that farmer investment increased around 30% once insurance was brought to the table. For those farmers, and these were farmers that on average were cultivating about 2 hectares of cotton, this amounted to something like a 25% increase in their family income. So really quite remarkably large responses. And there's about 5 studies out there now in Ghana, China, and a few other in India that find similar kinds of impacts. So that's the promise of index insurance, is that if you have new seeds, if you have new technologies, new practices, but that actually farmers are reluctant to adopt them because it's a financial or other kind of risk, then the hope is that index insurance can pull that risk out of the system and thereby generate large effects. So that's the promise of index insurance. Now, the picture on this slide is a woman in Marsabit district in northern Kenya. She's holding her insurance contract from Takaful Insurance, Africa. And I want you to keep that picture fixed in your mind for just a moment as we start talking then about the problems and the regulatory issues around index insurance. So the first point I want to make here is that, as I've stressed, that the great strength of index insurance is that it's based on an index related to but not identical to farmer losses. That's what makes the whole operation feasible to do. But it's also its greatest weakness, because given that the index will never be perfectly related to farmer losses, that raises the possibility and the reality that the farmer can have uncompensated losses. That's simply part of the problem. And indeed, perhaps because of that issue around the weaknesses of index insurance, a lot of index insurance projects have had real problems of low demand. They've never gotten off the ground. One of my early graduate students had to change his thesis topic because uptake of the insurance was so low, there was no way to actually study its effects. More important than broken dissertations is actually the problem of broken farmers. I'll be sharing with you in a moment some results of further analysis we did in a rice growing area of Tanzania. The background on that work is a large and well-respected NGO had launched an index insurance contract for a rice growing area where they were trying to get farmers to intensify their cultivation of rice, and they had very buoyant expectations about how the insurance was going to unlock the potential of these farmers to adopt improved practices. In the very first year of the scheme, the farmers had major losses, but the index insurance contract did not pay off. The way the contract was designed, and again, it's remotely sensed, and it simply did not properly trigger. The NGO was horrified because they could see the level of losses that had occurred to farmers. They had a big fight with the insurance company. Eventually, they simply shut down the index insurance operation, not because they didn't believe it could have worked, but because the quality of that contract, that is, its propensity to fail to pay off when farmers have uncompensated losses, it was much too high. And there are lots of examples like that. I could go through a handful. The Economist magazine actually recently wrote something where there should be malpractice insurance for index insurance contracts because there are so many examples. There was a very large blow up in Rwanda about 4 years ago around exactly this issue of large reported losses for farmers, and yet the insurance index not triggering. So what I'd like to do then is in the remainder of my time is to share a little bit of information on the rationale for quality standards for index insurance and certifying them, and then I'll say a little bit about what we're actually doing now with a new grant to try to design quality standards and actually certify them in an effort to actually help solve this very particular problem. So let's go back, or in our minds at least, to the picture of the woman holding the piece of paper. So index insurance contracts are, for example, very similar to a hybrid maize seed in the sense that the farmer can hold either the insurance contract in her hand or she can hold a hybrid maize seed in her hand. And exactly what's going on in that piece of paper or what's going on in the genetics of that seed is a hidden trait. The farmer can't tell by looking at the seed or looking at the contract paper. Can't really tell if that contract is going to protect her or not, or if those maize seeds are really going to yield what is promised. Now, in the case of maize seeds, we all know that most countries actually regulate seeds. They have germination tests, they have yield tests, etc. So when a seed is certified, the farmer can look at that mysterious seed in her hand and have some confidence that it's actually worth the money that's being charged for the seed. In index insurance, we don't have any, at the moment, we don't have anything equivalent. The farmer can hold that insurance piece of paper in her hand, but she doesn't really know what's the probability that she will not be compensated when she actually has a loss. So in that sense, I think there's a direct correlation, if you will, between the problem of regulation of seeds and the problem of regulation of insurance contracts, or indeed of any kind of technology where the quality of the technology is a hidden trait and can't be discerned by the farmer herself when she looks at it. If I'm an economist, if that's not already obvious, and if you put this kind of thing into an economic model, you can actually easily show that if there is no regulation of quality, it's very possible for the insurance market to end up in a junk equilibrium, meaning the bad insurance contracts drive out the good insurance contract. And if an insurance company tries to enter the market with a good insurance contract, it's costly for them to do that. And yet no one's going to believe it and no one's going to be willing to pay the cost. So I think the stakes here are quite high if we actually want this promising financial technology of index insurance to have its desired effect. So what we're going to do here and what we've been working on is trying to define what I call here on this slide a minimum quality standard. And the minimum quality standard is simply that the expected economic well-being of the insured is no lower with the insurance than without the insurance. So that's just a way of saying insurance contracts should not hurt the individual, should not make the individual worse off. There are ways, and I won't get too wonky in this talk, but there are ways using standard sort of economic tools to measure whether or not an index insurance meets that contract. So what I'd like to do first, and I'll spend a little more time on this first point, is I want to really drive home what's going on with insurance and why this quality issue is so important. And then I'll give you an example of actually how does one reach these kinds of minimum quality standards. And then I'll close with a few thoughts on how we might certify these quality standards. So let me just jump to this picture, and hopefully the size here is big enough. The horizontal axis here is just the level of income, and the vertical axis is the probability that a certain level of income occurs. So just to make a real simple example, suppose a farmer faces a world where there's good years and bad years. In good years, the farmer earns $1,000. In bad years, the farmer earns $250. The bad years happen 1 out of 5, so 20% of the time, and good years happen 80% of the time. So that's what the farmer faces, if you will. That's the lottery the farmer faces without insurance. So if the farmer has a perfectly well-functioning insurance, then the farmer would face not the red bars, but would face the blue bars that have been squeezed in. So this is an insurance contract where in bad years now the farmer's income is boosted from $250 to $530, but because the farmer is purchasing insurance that in this example is being priced at what's called the fair premium, or the actuarially fair premium, plus I believe this has a 20% markup, then the farmer's income in the good years is a little bit lower because she has to pay for the cost of the insurance. So again, insurance, and I think this needs to be stressed, insurance isn't free. I've done a number of projects on index insurance, and typically $1 that the farmer receives in a good year is costing that farmer about approximately $1.50. And so the question is, normally you'd say, would you pay $1.50 to get $1? And you'd say, well, that doesn't sound like a very good deal. But if you get that $1 in a time of need, and in a time of need, $1 in a sense is worth more to you than $1, then you may very well be very happy to make that trade-off. So that's the guts of insurance, is sort of squeezing together outcomes and giving up some money on average. In this particular case, the average income of the farmer with insurance goes down by about 5%. And the question is, would the farmer actually be better off giving up some income on average in order to have the stabilization effect, meaning moving the outcomes in good and bad years closer together, rather than having a really negative year where income is only $250. So again, using standard economic concepts, we can something called certainty equivalent, we can kind of answer this question. So this diagram, which I won't talk about too much, is if we have perfect insurance, then then if we look at the green line here, this is just showing perfect insurance would be the far left-hand side of this diagram. And we're saying when the farmer goes it alone without insurance, the certainty equivalent for that farmer, the level of well-being, sort of standardized level of well-being for that farmer is about $740. When the farmer has insurance and the insurance never fails, as a perfect insurance contract would, then you can see by the green line that the farmer's level of well-being is almost $800. So again, that's just a demonstration of it's for a contract that works pretty well. We can see the farmer would say, sure, I'll give up a little bit of income on average in order to get rid of that those really terrible years, which caused me to not be able to feed my family, to lose the capital I've invested in agriculture, etc. So that's perfect insurance. So hopefully that sort of helps fix ideas. Now let's look quickly at index insurance. So this kind of ugly looking picture is meant to demonstrate an index insurance contract which fails from time to time. And in fact, the failure rate here is actually about equal to the failure rate we've actually seen in the most commonly implemented kind of index insurance contracts, which are rainfall-based contracts that are typically based on the CHIRP satellite data. So it's actually an estimation of rainfall that occurs in a particular area, and then payments are made based on whether or not the estimated rainfall falls below some trigger level. So what I want you to concentrate here, the pink bars, again, that's what the farmer, those are the states of the world the farmer faces with no insurance. The blue bars here are what the farmer faces when the farmer has perfect insurance. And the green bars are actually what happens when the farmer has a sort of stylized insurance contract. And the thing to notice is in this picture, the first thing to notice is there's a little green bar way over on the left, okay? And as a friend of mine once put it, the thing with index insurance is, the weakness of index insurance is that the worst thing that can happen to the farmer gets worse. So we notice with that green bar away on the left, there's actually a small probability that the farmer will be stuck having purchased the insurance and hence paid the premium, having had a bad year, but then not being compensated. And so that's exactly what happened in Tanzania, what's happened in Rwanda, what's happened in Ethiopia, what's happened in a project in Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. So the worst thing that has happened has become worse. And so that's the danger of index insurance, is that it's a remotely sensed product. It has a certain spatial resolution. It has a certain accuracy to its ability to recognize when farmers actually have losses. And if it fails, if it gives what I call here on this bar on the left-hand side is a false negative, if a false negative happens, meaning the farmer had a loss, but the contract falsely says that the loss did not occur, then the farmer's actually been damaged by the presence of the insurance. And you can pretty easily imagine, I hope, that if those false negatives happen very frequently, the farmer's not going to be better off with insurance. The farmer would say, forget it. I don't want an insurance that sometimes helps me, but sometimes doesn't. The other side of the diagram shows what's called a false positive, which is also an issue in index insurance. So a false positive is when the farmer does not have a loss, but receives an insurance compensation. And so that's the bar on the green side, which shows a farmer who actually had a good year, but received an insurance payment. Now, at first look, that may seem like a good thing, like the farmer got money, isn't that good? But again, you need to remember the principle of insurance, that every dollar the farmer is getting is probably costing the farmer $1.50. And so receiving $1 in the good state of the world, when $1 is worth just $1, receiving $1 for which you paid $1.50 also makes the farmer worse off. So this is the danger of index insurance. We have its promise, we have its ability to implement contracts with small-scale farmers or small-scale pastoralists. That's extremely exciting. But all index insurance contracts have some element of this problem embedded in them. And the challenge then is to look for actual contracts that can meet a minimum quality standard. So let me skip over this. Is just, if any, I suspect these slides will be made available, but this is just showing that if the failure rate on an index insurance gets too high, then it actually fails to meet the minimum quality standard. and the farmer would actually be better off without the insurance than with the insurance. Or if the insurance is subsidized by the government, the equivalent calculation would say, the farmer would say, just give me the insurance subsidy money. I'd rather have the money as a cash transfer than having you buy me a low quality insurance contract that has too high false positive and false negative kinds of compensation. So I think I've already said a lot of this is that, this is not just a hypothetical example. Almost every index insurance project that runs on for a while eventually runs into what is sometimes called a basis risk event, or what I've been calling a false positive or false negative. And let's just look at this little diagram here to kind of think about the sources of false positives and false negatives. So this perhaps not entirely transparent picture, the width of that blue box, you can think of the width of that box as being the total risk that the farmer faces. And we can break that total risk into two pieces. There's risk that's correlated risk, that is risk that's common to everybody, say in a community. And there's risk that's purely idiosyncratic. So we typically think about weather risk as being a correlated risk. We think about animals trampling down your field as being an idiosyncratic risk that just influences the impact of one farmer. Now, we can further subdivide correlated risk into two sorts when you have an index insurance contract. There's the risk that the risk that's actually properly covered by the contract. And then there's what I call here design risk. So design risk is when an insurance contract fails to properly predict even losses that are the result of correlated events. So in my example in Tanzania, that was a correlated risk. All the farmers in this one particular area suffered large losses, but the insurance contract didn't even properly predict the average losses of farmers. And then on top of that, we have the idiosyncratic risk, meaning I may have larger losses than a neighbor farmer, but index insurance is never going to cover that idiosyncratic risk. So when we think about designing high quality insurance contracts, what we need to do is get rid of as much design risk as is humanly possible, squeeze that out. And there's still going to be an issue. If the idiosyncratic risk is too large, then it may be that even a well-designed contract that properly predicts average losses within a community, even that well-designed contract may not actually meet a minimum quality standard. So to give an example, we were invited to look into the possibility for doing index insurance in Nepal a couple of years ago. The funder was very interested in the hilly regions of Nepal. When we looked into it, we realized that almost all the risk was idiosyncratic, simply because the terrain was so hilly and variable. One farmer could have a frost event and her crops would die, and just 300 meters away, the farmer was perfectly fine. So even if we had been able to predict average yields correctly for farmers, or average losses correctly for farmers in that community, there was still going to be huge variation that was uninsured. So again, I say this because I think we need to be really careful thinking about index insurance. I think it's promising. That's why I keep working on it. And a lot of other people do as well, but we need to recognize it's not going to work everywhere, and it's not going to work anywhere if we don't work on designing contracts that eliminate design risk. So I think in the interest of time, let me just say a tiny little bit about some of the work that we've done. And we've implemented this recently in Tanzania and Mozambique both. So we designed a high quality remote sensing contract that gets more or less correct average yields within a village. So that's the insurance zone. But we recognize that our remote sensing sometimes fails us. So here's an example of this diagram here. The horizontal axis is showing the actual yields that farmers have had in a village in a particular time period. And the vertical axis is showing our predicted yields. The diagonal line is the 45-degree line. If we had perfect prediction, right, then we would all those dots would lie right on that diagonal line. And what you can see if you sort of stare at this a little bit, you can see that actually the satellite predictor is pretty good at picking up losses. But if you go over to the left side of the line, you can see when farmer losses were around 50%, that is, their yields were 50% of their normal yields. The satellite was way over predicting their yield, saying that they were only at 85% of the yield. So what we've done with this audit-based system is, number one, we work very hard in ground truth and try to create a reliable insurance index. And then secondly, we have a backup audit system. So if, for example, in the maize contracts we've been doing in Tanzania and Mozambique, we announce whether the satellite will pay or not. The insurance will pay based on the satellite index. Roughly 100 days into the season, we're technologically able to make that determination. And that gives farmers a few weeks to actually request an audit as they go along. And to make that cost effective, the audits can't happen very often. And in the case of Tanzania, they happen no more than about, I think it's about 4% of the time where an audit is actually necessary. So that cost was actually rolled into the insurance contract. So again, I think in the interest of time, this diagram here is just using real world data and showing that we can actually apply this minimum quality standard to different contracts. And it shows the trade-off between quality and cost of different insurance contracts. But the point here for our purposes was simply to make the point that it's indeed possible to design contracts that meet a minimum quality standard, but it takes some work. It takes collecting some data from the client farmers so you can actually determine what the probabilities of loss are. And then I would ultimately say it takes doing a few institutional things like creating a backup audit, because if you don't do that, you're really putting farmers at risk with this risk of an insurance contract making them worse off. So to summarize, if we want to design a contract for quality, we need to work on scaling down the insurance zones to the smallest possible level. And again, the work we've been doing that I mentioned in Tanzania and Mozambique, that's using pixel resolution off the MODIS satellites. It's 250 meters by 250 meters, so that's about 6 hectares. We're actually working now with some, in an exploratory way, with much higher resolution data. So the new European Sentinel satellites have 30 meter by 30 meter resolution. We have a private company provided us some data called Planet Labs, provided us data that's at 3 meter by 3 meter resolution, which is obviously getting very, very tiny. So I think in the end, we can work hard on pushing the technology as far as we can, but we need to ground truth. We need to get rid of this design risk. I think we need to consider backup fail-safe audits so we don't actually hurt farmers. And if we've done a good job designing contracts, the cost of that fail-safe audit should not be too high. And the final point I made here is sort of the Nepal point. We simply need to be aware that in some environments, the nature of risk is such that index insurance is just not going to work. The idiosyncratic risk element is simply too high, and no contract will work. So the final slide I want to use then is this one. So we've been talking about this for a long time, and we recently received a grant from USAID to establish what we're calling QUIC, for Quality Index Insurance Certification. And what we're going to do is we've got a meeting actually next week in Nairobi, working with insurance companies, reinsurance companies, with government line agencies that are promoting or are interested in index insurance. We're bringing these groups together from Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And we're going to try to see if we can create a community interested in quality certification. We have a remote sensing group based in Nairobi that also works with NASA. And they will hopefully serve as a certification body. So this is our idea, is to say remote sensing is exciting. It can, in the case of risk, it has this potential, as I said at the beginning, to have really gigantic impacts. But it's not going to have those gigantic impacts if it actually fails farmers or fails them too frequently. So we need to do something here about defining quality standards and implementing them. So let me stop here, and I hope that was a useful introduction to the use of big data and some of the challenges that come about when farmers are confronting whether or not to purchase products that are based on this kind of big data. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Michael, for this great presentation. I think it's really interesting the point you made on the hidden traits, and in the end, are we able to determine if farmers are better or worse when they have such a contract, or in our case, they use one of the digital services that are out there. So I think it's great because it's a very similar problematic. So we will now move to the Q&A station. I will invite participants to submit their questions to the chat. You can ask anything you want regarding the main problematic on the standardization and the need for standards in data-driven agronomy services, or more specific question to the presenter on the presentations. And also, while we are doing the Q&A, I invite participants to enter in this Mentimeter. So the idea is to do a quick poll and to ask about your opinion. So you just have to go to that webpage, menti.com, and you use the code that appears on the screen, and then you can submit your vote. All right. So, right. Waiting for participants to submit questions. We actually had some here prepared. So I wanted to ask to Michael, up to now, what has been the reaction of insurance companies to your initiatives of setting standards? Would you say there is a good buy-in, like this, they are seeing the opportunity, or are you seeing more reluctance?
Yeah, so I've been talking about this issue for some time to people and to insurance companies, and I think initially there was a lot of resistance, and they said, well, we know it's not perfect, but who cares? And I kept saying, you know, you have brand risk here. And I think slowly, as these kinds of events have happened, namely, you know, I mentioned the example of Rwanda. The president of Rwanda, at least the rural myth is the president of Rwanda got on the telephone with the president of the World Bank, which had sponsored the contract, and told him some rather unkind things about the World Bank and how could they possibly be promoting these failure-prone contracts. So I was just at a meeting in Switzerland recently that brought together a lot of people on this topic, and I was quite heartened. Actually, the head of Swiss Re, or not the head of Swiss Re, but a quite highly placed individual within Swiss Re said, you know, we agree. We've seen enough of these, and it's now time to have a quality standard, because right now we've got sort of an unregulated market, and we need to do something about that. So I think the industry is actually now ready for it. They were, I would say, based on my own experience and having had lots of fights with some industry partners before, I don't think they were ready for it 5 years ago. But I think the industry is starting to recognize that we need to be a little more careful. And the donor community, at least those that get forced to listen to me rattle on, I think is also becoming quite sensitive to this issue as well. And I think if we can get those two partners together, and donors and governments are sensitive to it as well, getting donors and governments to say, look, we want a quality standard, and if it can be even a voluntary standard, like ISO certifications are purely voluntary, and yet they carry information. So that's what we're hoping we can move toward. And I'm naively optimistic. Talk to me again in a week, and maybe I will have suffered bad things in Nairobi and discovered that the support is not there that I think is. But I do think it's time, and I think it's possible to move forward in the ways we've been discussing.
Great. Thank you. Because, yeah, actually, one of the hypotheses we are having is that eventually this kind of standards could benefit all the stakeholders, and including the providers, because they could compete on a common basis, and so they could promote services in a better way and with objective information and comparable. So that's a little bit the hypothesis.
Yeah, and just real quickly on that, as this may throw out an idea to someone. So part of what we're going to do is we're going to have some trial certification standards, and we're actually going to try to segment the market. We'll have to figure out exactly how we're going to do this, but we're going to try to test for the industry themselves, is if this is certified, if we publicize the mark, the quick mark, so to speak, and advertise that to farmers, will that actually have a beneficial impact on the demand for their products, because again, as I mentioned earlier, often demand is kind of low. So we're hoping we can get the buy-in of the industry, because they'll see that it is indeed in their interest as providers to have certification.
Right. Great. Thank you, Michael. We are still taking the chat, so participants, feel free to submit your questions. And meanwhile, I have one to Mariette. So the question is, what value would you expect from standards in fostering adoption? I'm thinking of the problem of the trust from users that they can have or lose in those tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I think we could quite easily link that to most likely the experiences that we all have on a day-to-day basis. I think when I look up a new product or a new application, and I'm going to my Google Play Store and I look at the different applications out there for a purpose that I'm looking for, then one of the things that I consider is, how is that application being rated? What are the reviews? How many stars does it get? So I take that into account. But I think if we could have also for ICT for Ag applications a good way of validating them and having a way to assess their quality and how well they can meet the demands of the users, then I think that would definitely help in the adoption of the applications. But you have to take into account there that would only count for those that are actually good applications, right? So it would be a way to also sort out which ones are the good ones and are worth your time and your investment, and which ones are the ones that you just don't have to bother even thinking about. So I think it can help in the adoption of some of them, and actually it can reduce the total number of applications out there and make it a lot more efficient, and also potentially help, for example, donors to find out where they would have to invest their money.
Great. That's right. Thank you for your answer. I think we don't have questions yet on the chat. I just wanted to thank presenters, because I really liked the different angles you adopted to contribute on the problematic. So we saw with Mariette how you're trying to tackle the problem of diversity by building a review, a typology, so that we can navigate among this diversity easily. And we saw that Caroline brought the example from the health sector, in which there are a lot of advances and progress made on precisely looking at the different tools and trying to rank them and classify them so that it's clearer. And then we had the nice experience from Michael about this problem with an insurance index and contracts that have hidden traits, and how can we help users to make better decisions on whether they would benefit from a contract or not. So right now, I invite people to vote on the second question. This is the last one on the Menti, and then I will pass the floor over to Daniel for a quick wrap-up. Daniel? Oh, okay. Really quick, and we take questions. Sorry, so we have questions coming out, so we will take the first one is from Manka. The bigger concern I see, at least in Cameroon, is that farmers aren't actually asking for index insurance. We are trying to do some pilot here. There's no regular framework for insurances in Cameroon, so this was very informal, and realized there was just very little demand for the service. I guess this is a question from Michael.
Okay, thank you for that question. And indeed, I mean, this is part of what makes insurance a novel technology. People, all the farmers we deal with, they've never had, they may know about motorcycle insurance at most, but they don't really understand how crop insurance might work. So there's a large educational thing. And you know, if you think about, let's go back to maize seeds, right? When a company introduces a new variety, they typically will give farmers a little pack of 250 grams of seeds and say, here, try this out yourself. And if you like it, then you'll buy it next year. Insurance is a really difficult thing. And this relates a little bit to some of the earlier discussion. It's very hard to learn about how good insurance is. right? Because insurance is only going to trigger a payoff once every 5 or 6 or 7 years. So even if you gave farmers a 250 grams free of insurance, they might have to wait 5 or 6 years before they do it, before they could actually learn anything about whether they like it or not, and understand how it works. So maybe in the Cameroon, so I run a research group called BASIS, so BASIS period UC Davis period EDU. We've gone to developing various kinds of simulation games where, you know, so if the learning problem for insurance is it takes many years to learn about it. So by creating a simulation game, so we just have one on tablets now we call Sim Pastoralist, which we just used in Samburu County in Kenya. That kind of device can allow people to start to understand. So the games are framed on people's realities as farmers or as pastoralists. It's a simplified version, but if it's close enough, people get it and actually enjoy it, and they can play their life. You know, they can live their life once without insurance. They can go through 20 seasons and see how things work and the shocks they face and what happens to them. And then you bring in insurance and say, here's how it works, and it costs some money. And then people can play the game with insurance, and they start to understand. And then typically after people understand how insurance works, then we play an incentivized game with them so they can then say, okay, do I want to buy it or not? And we pay them based on, you know, their final wealth or well-being of the family, depending on how we set the game up. So you're exactly right. It's a new technology. It's a complicated technology, but I think we have found that at least starting with a community or community leaders, there are some things you can do to help people understand. So if you go to that webpage I mentioned, searching around, you should be able to find some examples of some of these insurance games that I think are a starting point, at least so you can start to have a discussion and people will at least have some idea what you're talking about with insurance.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Manka, for your questions. So I pass the floor to Daniel for a quick wrap up.
Okay, so first, thank you guys for presenting. I mean, you all, Mariette, Caroline, and Michael gave an excellent presentation. So that I just figured out that I forgot in the beginning. So I didn't say that I'm the leader of the community of practice. I'm a trained agronomist and with the data science skills. And I'm very happy to see, I mean, this discussion that taking place right now. This is actually what we were looking for. Some takeaways, messages, or I mean, something that I can really take from Mariette's presentation. I'm looking at my notes, like when showing this diversity and landscape of different data-driven services. I was surprised to see that not necessarily private sectors are running all of them. Like you can also see like a key role of NGOs running some of those services, and pointing out that even though they are not all private sector, coming from the private sector from a profit perspective, they all have a clear mission and vision. So in the long term, I think they're good. Just that we need to work more on what the data-driven services are and the methods they use and the transparency. And also that is very important, and she brought from the presentation is this gender perspective and how can be affected, right? From Caroline, I mean, this is amazing and very inspiring presentation from the health sector. I mean, showing us even the principles of digital development, which probably many of them, some of us, few of us are not very familiar with. And like this roadmap that the health sector is following, right? Like they know where, how, and when make the interventions. They show this MEPS toolkit. I didn't know it, but it seemed like at the beginning I thought I was like a USAID document, because it really looked like probably my attention. Say like probably USAID will be interested in something similar. One question that I had for Caroline was like the science evidence that she was talking about, because something that we struggle is like the speed of publishing papers is not the same of the market of private companies. So I would like to ask what's the science evidence that you were talking about, and from Michael. I mean, Michael was presenting like the economic perspective of Indians insurance, and I really I was really happy to see, you know, like how he presented this idea that this is to actually make farmers that they shouldn't think that they are limited by some technology, because this is actually what these index insurances are meant to. And the rationale behind all of this, from not only the economic practical, but also the academic perspective, which we don't see too many of those. We don't see too many of those, like tackling the three perspectives. Usually in the academy is very different. I'm very pleased to listen Michael and his perspectives and the way how he made a point that in some that as economists, if there are no regulations, this is not good. But I also heard some other economists from the banking perspective saying that in these type of cases, usually the market itself will get rid of those that are weaker, right? So that's a different perspective, but usually that, and I talked to Silvana about it, is that happens in markets that are already in place. In this case, this is an emerging data-driven agronomy market, so it's a totally different perspective, and we should think more in the way probably Michael is thinking about it. So I think that's what I took from my notes. And
all right. Thank you very much, Daniel, for this wrap-up. We are now reaching the end of our time for this webinar. So I would like to thank a lot our presenters for their contribution, to thank participants to join us today. And I want to invite everybody to follow us. You can go to the page I'm sharing on the screen, and we'll share the link later on. This is the landing page of the Data-Driven Agronomy Community Practice, where you can get information about the coming events. We are hoping to host other webinars early next year. And also early next year, we plan to put together a working group that will be in charge of gathering the contribution of the community on this topic, and hopefully to be able to write some kind of reference document to move forward and to start build a reference scheme for the standards in data-driven agronomy services. So thank you very much to everybody, and we hope to see you next time on the COP webinar.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.